Welcome back to CSS Breakdown, book by book. In Season 08, Episode 07, we dive into a concept that is as ubiquitous as it is complex. Identity, as explored in Andrew J. Williams, Amelia Hadfield, and J. Simon Rose's International History and International Relations. Today, we're plunging into, well, one of the most fundamental yet kind of elusive forces shaping our world, identity. That's what defines us, right? Divides us, drives us from individuals right up to entire nations. We're going to try and uncover how identity isn't just some static label, but actually a dynamic, always evolving force, something that's, reshaping history and international relations.
And our mission here really is to unpack identity in three essential ways. First, just as a basic concept, what does it mean? It signifies both sameness and difference, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Second, how it works as an organizing category, grouping people culturally or politically. And third, its really powerful role as a legitimating principle, that force that motivates, that justifies these big demands, often for self-determination. And what's really fascinating, I think, is the core paradox the source brings up. Identity makes an actor at once both unlike and alike to all other actors. That tension, that kind of duality, that's where it gets really interesting for understanding how societies, how states define themselves and interact globally.
So let's peel back the layers on that core idea then.
Yeah.
Identity refers to the attributes or qualities by which an entity is recognized. But it is tricky, isn't it?
It is.
Because entities, people, groups, states, whatever, they get recognized in two ways that seem almost contradictory. They're identified by what they have in common with others, which lets us group them, but at the same time, they're recognized by what differentiates them, those unique things.
Exactly. Like a family resemblance you mentioned, you see the shared stuff, but also the individual quirks.
Yeah.
And the way identity gets used stretches across what the source calls a disciplinary panoply, which I think is a great phrase. It shows identity isn't fixed, it's kaleidoscopic. So what a psychologist sees as self-representation, usually relating to others, a historian might see as this force binding people together, city, region, nation, state level, socially, culturally, politically.
Right.
Then theorists of nationalism point to it as the key driver for the modern European nation-state. And political scientists, IR theorists, they see it as this internal dynamic promoting group coherence, defining interests that then impact how states behave.
This really depends on the lens you're using.
Totally context-dependent. Its meaning, its impact, it shifts based on the scale and the discipline. Makes it powerful, but also, elusive.
So to help us sort of navigate this, the text highlights some crucial distinctions, things to keep clear.
Good idea.
First, who are we talking about? The actor. Is it an individual, a group, a community?
Right.
Then how are we attributing identity? Is it about individuality, uniqueness, or commonality? Also, what types of identity? Political, cultural, national, ethnic, civic, there are lots. And finally, how is identity constructed? What's the process? Nationalism, patriotism, loyalty.
That framework is useful, definitely. And it's vital to remember, while national identity and nationalism are probably the most familiar forms in IH and IR,
Yeah, they pop up all the time.
there are dozens of other variants at play. This whole broad political sense of self-definition is incredibly complex. It draws from sociology, psychology, historical inquiry, IR theory. And what really stands out is that state versus nation dichotomy. That's a central tension in IH and IR. How do those two things relate? How do they clash? How do they merge? It shapes so much.
So given all that complexity, how essential is it then for understanding history, our world today? Is identity just one factor among many, or is it more fundamental than that, according to the source?
Oh, it definitely argues it's more fundamental. The source makes this really profound claim. Identity is arguably the most enduring and ubiquitous force of all. Analyses that fail to take account of it are visibly diminished.
Wow, okay. So
Yeah.
you ignored at your peril, basically.
Pretty much. It's not just a concept. It operates in this triple role. As an organizing principle, it applies to individuals, groups, states, even the whole system of states. As a category, it classifies political entities culturally, politically, economically, socially, and it differentiates between the content of the nation, the shared cultural stuff, and the form of the state, its political structure.
Okay.
And finally, as a concept, it helps explain motivation, group choices, state behavior, its flexibility, its pervasiveness.
It's really remarkable, especially now early 21st century, with these huge shifts, end of the Cold War, redefining states, European integration, pushing new identities while maybe reconfirming old ones, the move to global economies.
All those things push identity questions right to the surface.
Exactly.
So for historians specifically, how does identity work within their narratives? The source outlines two main ways. First, kind of long-term and passive, providing these broad storylines of the national self, grand narratives, right? Giving history a shape, beginning, rise, fall, end.
The big picture story. Yeah. And second, more short-term and dynamic through snapshots. These key moments, these pivotal events that sort of convey the quintessence of the national identity really quickly.
And you can see these shared modes of national experience really clearly in box 7.1 in the text. Think about origins, the foundation myths, America's First Nations versus the Founding Fathers, or ancient Persia for Iran.
Okay.
Then watershed moments, things that fracture the past, the Aztec conquest, the French Revolution, Hiroshima, even more recently like the Canadian Quebec referendum or the Czech-Slovak separation.
Moments of big change.
Or dealing with change, end of colonial rule, collapse of communism, the intifadas, and on the flip side, the confirmation of changelessness.
Yeah.
You know, orthodox views in places like Israel, North Korea, or contemporary Russia. These examples show how powerful narratives, selectively chosen and amplified, really shape identity.
That really highlights how history isn't just like a neutral record of the past. It's actively shaped, which leads to distinguishing between just knowing history and the selectivity of the past used in social memory. And that distinction seems crucial for IR scholars.
Why is that?
Because national history can be, well, expediently used for political ends. The source even says it can be used for manufacturing another identity or narrative. It's not just what happened, but how it's remembered and framed and used politically.
That's a really critical point. And when you look back historically at the self-other dynamic, you see this playing out again and again. Identity can be surprisingly fluid. Ancient Egypt, for instance, used ethnicity when conquering Nubia, but the source shows ethnicity there was actually quite mobile and permeable, not fixed at all.
Interesting.
Then you have Athenian rituals, Herodotus, Euripides talk about establishing these polarities, childhood versus adulthood, barbarian versus Greek, creating clear distinctions.
Defining us by defining them.
Precisely. And moving to Rome, you get the Roman civitas, the community, versus the non-Roman natio, the peoples or races outside. St. Paul's example in Acts is great. His Roman citizenship gives him political protection, stops him getting flogged.
Yeah, I remember that.
And Cicero puts it bluntly, all races are able to bear enslavement, but our community cannot. A very strong in-group versus out-group feeling, foundational stuff for identity.
And then tracing that shift. With Christianity, it goes from being the Roman other to eventually becoming the chief self in Europe.
Right. A huge transformation.
And parallel to that, we see the rise of these specific territories, city-states, kingdoms, and, crucially, area-specific languages. Like the Bishop of Cremona in 968 saying, land belongs, as the nationality and language of the people proves, to the Kingdom of Italy. That's an early linking of territory, language, and identity.
It is, but medieval views were still really layered. The term natio could describe University of Paris students based on birth, language, law, a very localized academic identity.
So not quite national in our sense.
Not yet. And you had all these other political organizations, the Holy Roman Empire, the papacy, duchies, guilds, each giving some kind of strategic protection and cultural affiliation. It was a complex web of loyalties.
Then Machiavelli hits us with that powerful phrase in 1527, Amo patria mia più dell'anima. I love my native city more than I love my soul.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah. And patria could mean city, fatherland, homeland, country. What does that tell us? Maybe the specific object of loyalty matters less than the dynamic of identity itself. It's a symbol of liberty, heritage, culture, something worth sacrificing for.
That phrase really does capture a pivotal moment because the early modern period, 16th to 18th centuries, that marks a huge transformation. Territorial states start becoming the main vehicle for authority and for collective identities. And this was driven by two things happening together. First, sovereignty becomes the benchmark for authority. And second, this sociological shift away from purely local loyalties family, kin towards broader national identification within that sovereign state.
A big reorientation of loyalty.
A fundamental one, away from the purely local, towards the state.
And then moving into the late modern period, 19th, 20th centuries, these state-based entities become standardized sovereign units. And national identity does double duty here, right? It confirms their legitimacy as the right kind of unit, but it also becomes the basis for demanding a new state. based on self-determination.
Yeah.
We share an identity, so we deserve our own state.
Exactly. But interestingly, at the same time, you had Enlightenment views pushing a more cosmopolitan universalist idea.
Right, the idea that borders don't really matter for who we are.
Yeah, they saw political frontiers as just instrumental for the state to function, not really substantive for political identity. For them, identity was more about language, literature, culture, but without necessarily carrying political weight. A more abstract, universal view, quite different from those emerging nationalisms.
Okay, this feels like a perfect point to pivot. To really get how identity evolved, we need to dig into some of the philosophical roots. Where do we start with that, especially from the liberal tradition?
Well, a key figure, maybe surprisingly foundational, is John Locke and his theory of mind. He's seen as a progenitor of modern identity theory.
How so?
He was really the first philosopher to define the self through consciousness, starting with the mind as a tabula rasa, a blank slate.
No innate ideas.
Exactly. All ideas come from experience, sensory input, and reflection. Locke's self is entirely conscious, self-aware, always reflecting. And the key insight for collective identity is this. For a group identity to work, it has to be explicit and self-aware, not just some vague feeling. Locke defined the self as that conscious thinking thing, sensible, of pleasure and pain, capable of happiness or misery.
That's fascinating, and he makes three critical points that really shape things, didn't he?
He did. First, ideas build up through sense and reflection, especially education.
Okay.
Second, and this is crucial for us, this associationism, how ideas connect, also operates collectively. So groups develop shared ideas about who they are, and importantly, who they are relative to others. That self-other thing again.
Right, defining us.
Yeah. And third, he argued that the best political setup is a contractual state defending basic rights, life, health, liberty, or possessions.
Okay, so Locke lays some groundwork. How does that connect to others?
Well, it connects directly to people like Kant and Rousseau and the whole contractarian view of society. Kant especially clarified self-determination. Freedom wasn't just freedom from outside control, it was the autonomy of giving the law to oneself.
Oh, okay. Positive liberty.
Right. And collectively, this implies a group can claim autonomy, define its own laws. That idea had a massive impact on later political movements, nationalism, the right of a people to govern themselves.
Got it. Now, Hegel, often seen as the champion of the state, right?
Yes. But the text highlights his logic for how states achieve greatness. It's by finding an equilibrium between the self and its opposite, the other.
So states need other states.
In a way, yes, to define themselves. Just like individuals need an other to fully grasp their own self, it's this dynamic relational process where identity emerges through interaction and contrast.
Interesting. So not just internal definition, but external comparison, too.
Precisely. Which brings us neatly to that crucial 18th century distinction. Political nations versus cultural nations. Identity was seen as both a political tool for the state and a cultural one for the nation.
Give me an example.
Okay, the French Revolution really exemplified the political nation. Sovereignty shifted from the monarch to the people, embodying a civic identity. Being French meant adhering to shared political ideals like liberty, equality, fraternity. CIs argued the nation actually came before the state.
Okay. Based on shared political principles.
Right. On the flip side, you had German Romanticism, championed by thinkers like Herder. They emphasized the cultural nation.
What did that look like?
It focused on essentialist, more authentic roots, shared heritage, history, ancestry, a unique cultural spirit, or Volksgeist. It was a qualitative view, seeing the nation as organic, greater than the sum of its parts.
Sounds appealing, but what are the problems with that cultural nation idea? The source seems skeptical, calling Herder's and Hegel's ideas of common language, territory, or economic life largely improbable fictions.
Yeah, and for good reasons. First, language. It's rarely just one language, is it? Many states are multilingual. Lingua francas span huge identities. The text argues languages often get elevated to symbols rather than being inherently singular.
Okay.
Second, territory. Borders almost never perfectly match perceived national frontiers. Lots of states are multi-territorial. And it doesn't help people without land, like diasporas. Territory becomes more a symbolic means of mobilization, a chosen marker.
Right. Not necessarily a natural boundary.
Exactly. And third, common economic or national characters. Globalization has kind of blurred those. And national characteristics are often selectively chosen, reflecting biases more than reality. It's much more constructed than it first appears.
So the 20th century then tried to make sense of all this by categorizing these developments into theories of nationalism, focusing on identity society's role, how individual identity links up with these bigger units.
Yep, three main schools emerge. First, the Genesis School, think Cone, Carleton, came about post-WWII, trying to explain the nationalism behind the wars. They distinguish Western nationalism population identifies as a nation, then with an existing state, like England, France. From Eastern nationalism, culture comes first, creates the state to protect culture, often redrawing borders ethnographically.
Okay, civic versus ethnic, basically.
Sort of the precursor to that debate, yeah. Though now it's seen as a bit archaic, maybe chauvinistic because it's so rigid either, but it laid groundwork.
Then we get the modernist school. Gellner, Kaduri, Deutsch. Their goal was to unmask the processes, making culture this universal organizer, they asked. Did cultural groups consciously form before nationalism kicked off?
Exactly. They challenged that primordial Volksgeist idea. For modernists, identity is a moving process, deliberately constructed for state building. Gellner linked it to industrialization needing a mobile workforce and standard language. Kaduri called nationalism a doctrine invented in Europe in the 19th century, a political project.
Okay.
Deutsch and Benedict Anderson highlighted standardized language, print culture, mass literacy, the linguistic bedrock for group consciousness.
So for them, it's much more top-down, state-driven.
Largely, yes. The key modernist insight is that national identifiers thrive within the standard state unit. The state both protects the culture and promotes the identity. Paradoxically, the nation's uniqueness and its specificity is fully realized in the standardized unit of the state.
Which then leads to the pushback from the third school, ethnicity redux, the primordialists.
Right.
Connor, Anthony Smith.
Right, they swung the pendulum back hard, challenged the modernists directly. They argued identity is far older, far more intangible and complex. Boosted by post-colonial movements, they stressed the immutable role of ethnicity. Nations aren't inventions, they're authentic, rooted in genuine cultural communities that predate nationalism.
So for them, identity isn't made, it makes us.
Pretty much. Identity fashions people, it is not fashioned by people. A very different perspective.
So where does the source land in all this? What's the contemporary synthesis?
It suggests the neat split between political and cultural identities is often too simple. Principles, symbols they can apply equally to state and nation. The key, the source argues, is the perception of them regarding their ultimate use in pursuing cultural or political ends.
Meaning, if people believe in these attributes enough to act on them,
then identity has a real causal effect. It doesn't matter so much if it's objectively political or cultural. It matters if people act as if it is.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
So maybe historians and political theorists are both kind of correct.
In a way, yes. When history's constitutive force, its narrative power, combines with group order and will, you get what the text calls a willens nation, a nation by sheer will.
Combining the ethnic-cultural symbolic with civic-political strategic. A deliberate act of self-creation.
Exactly. Which brings us to the problem with IR often just using nation-state as a catch-all.
Right. It smooths over the complexities, ignores the nation part.
Yeah, it ignores the nation itself and its internal dynamics. Look at the European Union. Box 7.3 uses it as a great example. The EU is trying to build a modernist identity, right? A political one. But people still tend to identify with their nation first, not just identify the union.
And reducing internal borders.
Paradoxically, it seems to have increased the salience of the border between the union and the rest of the world, and maybe even heightened tensions among member states.
Because unity and diversity is tricky for identity.
Very tricky. Because fundamentally, identity is about difference. It's about defining an us against them. That unity and diversity slogan runs right up against that basic function of identity.
So even with globalization, transnational bodies, states hang around. They remain enduring precisely because they confer identity, order, and authority. That sense of belonging within borders is still incredibly strong.
It seems so.
Which is a great segue into why international relations, maybe surprisingly, took a while to really grab onto identity as a core variable. Why was that?
Well, the text suggests it was identity's definitional virility. It's so potent, means so many things, that it led to analytical impotence.
Huh. Meaning it was too complex to easily measure or use?
Kind of. It was so broad, so hard to pin down, scholars struggled to use it rigorously as a single measurable factor, and almost paralyzed their ability to analyze its specific effects. Too powerful, too shape-shifting for the existing IR models.
Okay, so how did different IR schools eventually grapple with it? Let's start with the realists.
Sure. For realists, identity is existent but rather uninteresting. Yeah, they see it mainly as functional. Domestically, it creates civic allegiance citizenship. Externally, it marks states off via sovereignty. Since realists tend to see states as unified actors behaving similarly based on power politics, identity is just generic. It indicates people stick to their political units, but the reasons are assumed to be similar everywhere. It doesn't explain variation in behavior much.
A very stripped-down view. What about liberal views?
Agreeably wider, as the text says. Liberals recognize broader civic identities and also exogenous self-recognition, how others see you matters. Identity is unique, not just instrumental. Differences are valued. But there's a paradox. Liberalism respects cultural difference, but also stresses universal human qualities like human rights.
Which leads to that cosmopolitan idea.
Exactly. The cosmopolitan perspective, like Chris Brown argues, says the only true and foundational identity we possess derives from our common membership in the human race. Everything else is secondary. State borders are arbitrary, not real identity drivers.
But the problem there is
humanity is just too big, too nonspecific for most people to build a strong, actionable identity around it. It lacks that concrete ooze.
Okay. What about Marxism?
For Marxists, economic position, social class, that's the key unifying factor. Other identities like nationality or religion, they're transitional, expected to fade away under communism. Class identity trumps all.
And the communitarian perspective, it derives from realism.
Yeah, it shares realism's focus on the state, but gives identity more weight. The state and its borders are paramount, containing a unique, self-contained community. Communitarians argue identifying purely with generic human identity is unrealistic because we're all products of particular cultures.
And this has consequences.
4 main ones, according to the text. 1, local symbols are really potent. 2, how we define ourselves is inherently political. 3, it binds people strongly to their place, their boundaries. And 4, identity clearly denotes both who a self is and who it is not. That self-other distinction again.
So that's the main clash, isn't it? Equality cross borders, cosmopolitan versus differences defined by borders, communitarian.
Absolutely. Communitarians insist the maintenance of borders is central to identity formation and preservation. Without them, they argue, human identity itself was put in question. A profound disagreement.
Which brings us finally to the constructivist and critical paradigms. They seem better equipped to handle identity's complexity.
They definitely are. Constructivism sees identity as describing the forces, both material and intangible, through which political and social realities are, well, constructed. The end of the Cold War really opened the door for this, breaking realism's hold. States become agents, creating their social environment, then internalizing it, this idea of mutual constitution. States shape the system shapes states.
And Alexander Wendt was key here.
Huge. Applying sociology to IR, his famous line, anarchy is what states make of it. States interact based on shared intersubjective meanings. Identities are socially constructed. Though Wendt, especially early on, perhaps saw them more as instrumental bearers of interest rather than the primary causal drivers themselves.
And the critical variants, post-structuralism, they push even further.
They do. They look at identity not just as a given self, but as a form of difference, how the self is defined against an other. Identity becomes this analytical concept focusing on the complex political and social methods of identification and behavior.
Highlighting those nested and contested qualities that people draw on. Identity is fluid, negotiated.
Exactly. So the upshot is identity is now, as the source puts it, a semi-accepted variable in IR. Its influence is growing, even filtering into things like neoclassical realism, helping it capture more historical and cultural factors.
But feels essential for a richer understanding.
Definitely, giving identity the analytical weight it deserves.
So wrapping this up, what does it all mean? We've taken this really fascinating deep dive into identity. From its, ancient roots and philosophical ideas right through to its crucial dynamic role in defining states, nations, international relations. We've seen how it's both about sameness and difference, how it works as a category for grouping people, and how it acts as this principle that legitimizes really big demands.
And the source ends, quite fittingly, with Montesquieu's view of the nation-state, that it's historical, a layering of diverse causalities, and it actually provides the conditions for its own transcendence into even more specific categories. Identity is this constant, evolving force, never static, always shaping, always being shaped.
Yeah. This whole deep dive really shows how deeply intertwined our understanding of history and IR is with how groups, individuals, define who they are, and maybe just as importantly, who they are not.
Mm-hmm.
It's a powerful reminder, I think, that underneath all the headlines about state interactions and global events, you've got these fundamental questions bubbling away: self, belonging, difference. Always at play, always in motion.
Which leaves us with a really interesting question for you, the listener, to think about. If identity truly is this fluid and so profoundly shaped by both history and our present choices, how might these massive global challenges we face now, climate change, technological disruption, how might they lead to entirely new forms of collective identity, ones that maybe transcend our current state-based ways of thinking? What kind of self, what kind of us might emerge in a world that's getting more interconnected in some ways, yet still feels deeply divided in others? Something to mull over.